You should have told me before I chose power over you." His voice was lower than I remembered, rough in a way that made my chest tighten. But I didn't look up. Not yet, because if I did, I knew I might break, and I had spent the last 5 years learning how not to break. The marble floor beneath my shoes was cold, polished enough to reflect the faint curve of my stomach, and I could feel his eyes there, fixed, unmoving, as if the truth had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about me, about us, about that night he erased like it meant nothing, and maybe it hadn't meant anything to him back then, just another calculated mistake in a life built on control. But for me it had been the moment everything changed, the moment everything began, and the moment everything ended all at once. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady even though my pulse was racing so loud it felt like it echoed in the empty hallway. "You made your choice, Alexander. Don't pretend you didn't know what it cost." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with words neither of us knew how to say. And for a second I was back there again, 5 years ago, standing in a room filled with people who looked at me like I didn't belong, dressed in borrowed confidence that never quite fit, watching him across the distance like he was something untouchable, something unreal. Alexander Knight, the man everyone whispered about, the man who built empires with a single decision, the man who didn't lose until he looked at me, really looked at me, and something shifted, something quiet and dangerous, something I was too naive to understand at the time. It wasn't supposed to matter. None of it was. Just one night where the world slowed down long enough for two completely different lives to collide. No promises, no expectations, just a moment of shared silence that felt too real to be accidental, and I left before morning. Because I knew better than to believe in things that didn't belong to me. Because men like him didn't choose people like me. And I told myself I was fine with that. Until 2 months later when everything changed, when the test in my shaking hands told me that night hadn't been something I could walk away from, that it had left a mark that would follow me forever. I thought about telling him. I did, more times than I could count, but then I saw the announcement, the merger, the engagement that would secure his position at the top of a world I could never even step into. And suddenly it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about survival, about protecting something fragile in a world that would tear it apart if it knew. So I disappeared, quietly, completely. Building a life from nothing in a town where no one knew my name, where I could breathe without looking over my shoulder, where I could pretend that the ache in my chest didn't still belong to him. And now here he was, standing too close, breaking through everything I had built, his presence as overwhelming as ever. Except this time there was something different in his eyes, something unfamiliar, something almost like regret. And I hated that it still affected me, hated that part of me still remembered what it felt like to be seen by him, because I couldn't afford that weakness anymore. Not now. Not when everything that mattered was at stake. So I lifted my chin, finally meeting his gaze, letting him see that I wasn't the same person he left behind, that I had survived without him, that I didn't need him. Even if a small, dangerous part of me still wondered what would happen if, just this once, he chose something other than power. He did not answer right away. And that silence was louder than anything he could have said, stretching between us until it felt like the walls themselves were listening, until I almost regretted looking at him at all, because there it was again, that shift in his expression, subtle but undeniable, like something inside him had cracked just enough to let the truth in. And for a man like Alexander Knight, that was more dangerous than anger. His gaze dropped again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if he was forcing himself to see what he had ignored 5 years ago. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the sharp authority I remembered. "How far along are you?" And the question hit harder than it should have, not because of the words, but because of what they meant, because he was not denying it, not questioning it. He already knew, or at least some part of him had already accepted it, and I felt my fingers curl slightly at my sides, grounding myself before I answered. 7 months. I said, steady, factual, leaving no room for interpretation, and I watched the way that number landed, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his shoulders stiffened as if he was calculating something, counting backward, placing timelines against decisions he had made without thinking about consequences. "You left," he said after a moment, not accusing, not defensive, just stating it like a fact he was trying to understand, and I let out a quiet breath. almost a laugh, but without humor. You made it very clear there was nothing for me to stay for, I replied, and this time I did not look away, because I needed him to see it. To see that I remembered exactly how it happened, the announcement, the cameras, the way he stood beside someone else like it was always meant to be that way, like I had never existed in his world at all. His hand flexed at his side, a small movement that most people would miss, but I did not, because I had once known him well enough to understand what it meant, that he was holding something back, something sharp and complicated, and for a second I wondered if he would deny it, if he would say it was necessary, strategic, that everything he did had a reason, but he did not. Instead he asked, "Why did you not tell me?" And that question, simple as it was, almost broke something inside me, because it sounded like regret, and regret was not something I had prepared for. Anger I could handle, indifference I had survived, but this quiet shift, it made everything harder. I shook my head slightly, not in confusion, but in disbelief. Would it have changed anything? I asked, and he did not answer, because we both knew the truth, because back then, nothing would have been enough to make him choose differently. Not me, not this child, not anything that threatened the power he had spent his entire life building. The air between us shifted again, heavier now, more complicated, and I took a small step back. Instinct more than decision. Creating space because I needed it, because standing this close to him felt like standing too close to a past I had fought too hard to leave behind. "You do not get to come back now and act like this matters," I said, my voice softer but no less firm. "I build a life without you, Alexander. I am not asking for anything." And that was the truth, the only truth that had kept me going all this time, that I did not need him, that I had learned how to survive on my own, even when it was hard, even when every step felt uncertain. And for a moment, I thought he would let me go, that he would step back into the world he had chosen and leave me in mine. But instead he took a single step forward, closing the distance I had tried to create, his presence immediate and undeniable. And when he spoke again, there was something new in his voice, something that made my heart stutter despite everything I told myself. "It matters now," he said, and I realized with a sudden, unsettling clarity that whatever this was, whatever had changed in him, it was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be easy, because for the first time, Alexander Knight was not looking at me like a mistake. He was looking at me like a choice. The word choice echoed in my mind long after he said it, not because it was loud or forceful, but because it was not, because for the first time since I had known him, Alexander Knight sounded uncertain, and that alone was enough to unsettle everything I thought I understood about him. I studied his face, searching for the familiar signs of control, the calculated distance, the quiet arrogance that used to define him. But what I found instead was something quieter, something heavier, like he was carrying the weight of a realization he had not expected to face. And it made me instinctively guard myself even more, because people like him did not change easily, and if they did, it was never without consequences. "You do not get to decide that now," I said, keeping my voice even though my heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. "You had your chance, and you walked away." And this time there was no hesitation in my words, no softness left from the past, just truth, because I needed him to understand that whatever this was, whatever he thought he could fix, it was not something that could be undone with a single decision. His eyes did not leave mine, and for a moment I thought he would argue, that he would push back the way he used to, with logic and authority and that quiet, relentless confidence that always made people step aside for him. But instead he exhaled slowly, like he was recalibrating, like he was learning how to stand in a situation where power did not immediately give him control. "I did not know," he said, and there was no excuse in it, no justification, just a statement that felt incomplete, because it was, because not knowing had been a choice too, one he made the moment he decided I did not matter enough to ask. "You did not want to know," I replied, softer now, not because I was forgiving him, but because I was tired of carrying this alone, tired of pretending it had not hurt. And for a brief second something flickered in his expression again, something closer to guilt, something real, and it made me look away first, because I could not afford to let that pull me back in. The hallway felt smaller now, like the space between us had compressed into something too intense, too complicated, and I shifted my weight slightly, one hand instinctively resting against my stomach, a quiet reminder of why I could not let this moment weaken me. Because this was no longer just about me. It had not been for a long time, and everything I had done, every decision, every sacrifice, had been for the life I was carrying, not for him, never for him. I am not here to reopen the past. I continued, steadying myself. I came here for work, nothing else, and I am leaving tomorrow morning. And that was the plan, the only plan. Keep moving. Do not stay long enough for anything to catch up. Do not let old connections become new problems. It had worked for years, and it would work again. It had to. But he did not move, did not step aside, did not give me the space I needed to leave. And that alone told me everything had already changed. Because Alexander Knight was not a man who stood still unless he had decided something mattered. And the way he was looking at me now, it was not distant, it was not dismissive, it was focused, deliberate, like he was already thinking 10 steps ahead, like he was already reshaping the future to fit a new reality. You are not leaving, he said finally. Not as a command, not in the way he used to speak, but as a certainty. And that certainty sent a chill through me, not because I believed he could force me, but because part of me recognized that tone, that quiet conviction that meant he had already decided what came next. I straightened, meeting his gaze again, refusing to let that certainty define me the way it once might have. You do not get to decide that either, I said, and this time there was no hesitation at all, because whatever this was, whatever he thought he could rebuild, I was not the same person he left behind, and I would not let him rewrite my life just because he finally realized it mattered. Even if a small, dangerous part of me was beginning to understand that he was not going to walk away this time, not easily, not quietly, and not without trying to claim a place in a life he had once abandoned. For a moment, neither of us moved, and it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to the space between us, to the quiet tension that refused to break, until I finally stepped to the side, intending to walk past him, to end this before it could become something I could not control. But his voice followed me before I could take more than a single step. Where are you staying? And the question was immediate, precise. The kind of question that was never just a question when it came from him. I paused, not turning back right away, because I knew what this was, not concern, not curiosity, but strategy, the beginning of something calculated, something I had seen before, and I could not let myself be pulled into it again. That is none of your business, I replied, keeping my tone calm, even as I felt the familiar pressure of his presence behind me, the weight of someone who was used to getting answers simply because he asked for them. It is my business now, he said, and there it was again, that shift, that quiet certainty that made it clear he was no longer standing at the edge of this situation. He was stepping into it fully, and I turned back then, meeting his gaze with a steadiness I had learned the hard way. You do not get to decide that just because you decided to care now, I said, and the words hung there, sharp but honest, because this was the truth he needed to hear, that timing mattered, that choices had consequences that could not be undone just because he finally understood them. His expression did not harden the way it used to when someone challenged him. Instead, it grew more focused, more intent, like he was adjusting, adapting, and that unsettled me more than anger ever could, because it meant he was not going to walk away from this. He was going to figure it out. You are 7 months pregnant and traveling alone, he said, his tone quieter but no less firm. That is not something I am going to ignore. And for a second something inside me tightened, not because he was wrong, but because I had spent so long convincing myself that I did not need anyone to notice that I could handle it on my own, that hearing someone say it out loud felt like a crack in the armor I had built. I have handled everything just fine without you, I answered, lifting my chin slightly, holding on to that truth like it was the only thing keeping me steady, because it had to be. He studied me for a long moment, his eyes moving briefly to where my hand still rested against my stomach before returning to my face. And there was something in that look that made my breath catch, not softness exactly, but something close to it, something protective, and that scared me more than anything else, because I could not afford to let that mean anything. That does not mean you should have to, he said, and the quiet weight of those words settled between us in a way I was not prepared for, because they were not controlling, not demanding, just different, and for the first time since this conversation started, I did not have an immediate response, did not have a defense ready, because no one had ever said that to me before, not like that, not without expecting something in return. I forced myself to look away, breaking the moment before it could grow into something dangerous, something that might weaken the resolve I had built over years of doing this alone. I do not need anything from you, I said finally, softer now but still certain, because I had to be, because if I was not, everything I had done to protect this life would start to unravel. But when I turned to leave again, he did not try to stop me this time, did not reach out or block my path. And for a brief moment I thought that was it, that he had accepted it, that this would end here, just another encounter left behind, until his voice came again, steady and unyielding in a way that made my steps falter despite myself. I will find you, he said, not as a threat, not as a promise meant to intimidate, but as something simpler, something more certain, because this is not something I am walking away from. And I felt it then, deep and undeniable, that this was no longer just a past resurfacing for a moment. It was something that had already begun to move forward, something that was going to follow me whether I wanted it to or not. And as I stepped out into the cool evening air, one hand instinctively resting over the life I had fought so hard to protect, I realized that for the first time in years, running might not be enough. I did not go back to the hotel right away, even though I told myself I would, even though every instinct was telling me to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever it was that had just shifted in Alexander's world, because the way he had looked at me, the way he had said he would find me, it was not empty confidence. It was the kind of certainty that had built his entire empire, and I knew better than to underestimate it. The city air was cooler than I expected, brushing against my skin as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the noise of passing cars and distant voices ground me, reminding me that this was real, that I was not back in the past, that I still had control over what happened next, but control felt thinner than it had this morning, like something had already begun to slip through my fingers. I pulled my coat a little tighter around me, one hand resting protectively over my stomach as I started walking, not toward anywhere specific, just away, because distance had always been my first defense, distance and silence. The two things that had kept me safe for the last 5 years, the two things that had allowed me to build something stable out of nothing, a quiet life where no one asked questions and no one looked too closely. I had a routine there, a small apartment above a bookstore, a job that paid just enough, a doctor who knew me only as a patient and nothing more, and for the first time in a long time, I had felt steady, like I could finally breathe without waiting for everything to fall apart. And now, in the span of a single conversation, all of that felt fragile again, like it could disappear if I made one wrong move. My phone buzzed in my pocket, sharp enough to pull me out of my thoughts, and I hesitated before pulling it out, already knowing who it might be, already feeling that quiet tension settle in my chest. But when I looked at the screen, it was not him. Just a message from the clinic confirming my appointment tomorrow morning, routine, normal, something I could hold on to, and I exhaled slowly, letting that small piece of normalcy steady me again. I could still leave, I reminded myself. I could get on the train in the morning, go back to the life I had built, and this would become nothing more than a moment, something I could file away and move past the same way I had done before, because I had done it once. I could do it again. But even as I told myself that, I could not ignore the feeling that something had already changed, not just in him, but in me, because hearing him say it mattered. Hearing him acknowledge what he had once dismissed, it had stirred something I thought I had buried, something I did not want to face. I slowed as I reached the corner, the glow of a streetlight casting long shadows across the pavement, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to stop, to think, to really consider what I wanted, not what was safe, not what was practical, but what I actually wanted. And the answer did not come as easily as it should have, because part of me still remembered what it felt like to be chosen, even if it had only been for a moment, and that memory was dangerous in ways I could not afford. A car passed by, its headlights sweeping across me before disappearing into the distance, and I straightened, pushing the thought away before it could take root, because this was not about me anymore. It had not been for a long time, and every decision I made now had to be about protecting the future I was carrying, not revisiting a past that had already proven it could not hold me. I turned back toward the hotel then, steps more deliberate now, because I had made up my mind. I would leave in the morning. I would go back, and I would not look back again, no matter what he said, no matter what he did, because I had learned the hard way that survival sometimes meant walking away before things had the chance to break you again, even if part of you still wondered what might happen if you stayed. The next morning came too quickly, or maybe I had not really slept at all, because when the alarm went off at 6:30, it felt like I had just closed my eyes, and for a moment I lay there staring at the ceiling of the hotel room, letting the quiet settle over me before everything else could rush back in. But it did anyway. The memory of his voice, the certainty in it, the way he had said he would find me, and I pushed it aside before it could take hold, because today was supposed to be simple. Leave, go back, return to the life I understood. I moved through the routine automatically, shower, dress, pack, every motion deliberate, controlled, like if I kept everything precise enough, I could keep my thoughts from wandering, but it did not completely work, because every so often I would pause, just for a second, like I was listening. For something I told myself was not there. By 7:15 I was ready, my bag by the door, my phone in my hand, the confirmation for my train already pulled up on the screen, and all I had to do was leave, just walk out and not look back, just like I had done 5 years ago, just like I had promised myself I would always do if the past ever tried to catch up with me. I reached for the handle, my fingers brushing the cool metal, and that was when there was a knock, not loud, not urgent, but steady, deliberate, and my entire body went still because I already knew, before I even moved, before I even thought about it. I knew exactly who it was. For a moment, I did not open the door. I just stood there, my hand still on the handle, my heart beating faster than it should have, because part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I was not there, to leave through the back stairs and disappear before this could become something more. But another part of me, the part that had always needed closure even when it hurt, that part would not let me walk away without facing it. The knock came again, just as measured as before, and I exhaled slowly before opening the door. He was standing there like he had been there the entire time, composed, controlled, dressed in the same quiet precision that had always defined him. But there was something different in the way he looked at me now, something more direct, more certain, like he had already crossed a line he could not uncross. "You are leaving," he said, not asking, and I held his gaze, refusing to step back, refusing to let him take control of the moment just by being there. That was always the plan. I replied, my voice steady despite the tension building in the space between us. His eyes flicked briefly to the bag by the door, taking in everything with that same efficiency that made him impossible to read, and then back to me. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, less uncertain, more like something was about to shift. "Cancel it," he said, and the words were quiet, but they carried weight. Not the kind that forced compliance, but the kind that assumed it, and I felt something sharp rise in my chest at that, because this was exactly what I had expected, exactly what I had prepared for. The moment he would try to take control, to turn this into something he could manage, something he could win. I shook my head immediately, not even giving myself time to consider it. "No," I said, firm, clear, because this was the line I could not let him cross. "I am not staying." And for the first time since he arrived, something shifted in his expression again. Not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something that made his next words land heavier than anything he had said so far. "Then I am coming with you." And the certainty in that statement hit harder than anything else, because it was not a request, it was not a negotiation, it was a decision. And I realized in that moment that leaving might not be as simple as walking away anymore, because he was no longer standing on the outside of my life, he was stepping directly into it. For a second I thought I had heard him wrong, because the words did not fit, not with the man I knew, not with the version of him I had spent years trying to forget, but the way he stood there, calm and certain, told me I had not misunderstood anything at all, and something in my chest tightened in response. Not fear exactly, but something just as sharp, because this was not how this was supposed to go. "You are not coming with me," I said immediately, the words firm before I could second-guess them, because if I hesitated even for a moment, I knew he would see it. He would find a way in, And I could not let that happen. Not now. Not when everything I had built depended on distance, on control, on keeping him out of it. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened slightly, focusing in a way that made it clear he was not reconsidering anything. I am, he replied, just as simply, like it was already decided, like it was no more complicated than choosing a destination, and that calm certainty hit harder than any argument could have, because it meant he was not trying to convince me, he was preparing to act. You cannot just insert yourself into my life because you suddenly decided it matters, I said, stepping back slightly, more instinct than intention, creating space because I needed it, because the closer he stood, the harder it was to think clearly, the harder it was to hold on to the boundaries I had set so carefully. For a moment he was silent, and I could see it. The shift behind his eyes, the calculation, the way he was adjusting to something he had not expected, not resistance exactly, but the kind of resistance that did not bend easily. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but there was something stronger beneath it, something that made my breath catch despite myself. It has always mattered, he said, and the words landed with a weight that felt heavier than anything else he had said, because they sounded real, because they sounded like something he had not allowed himself to admit until now. I shook my head, not in denial, but in disbelief, because I could not afford to believe that. Not after everything. Not after the way he had looked at me back then like I was nothing more than a mistake he could walk away from without consequence. Then you should have acted like it did, I replied, softer now, but no less certain, because this was the truth that defined everything between us. The silence that followed was different this time, not empty, not tense, but heavy, like both of us understood that something fundamental had shifted and neither of us knew exactly what to do with it. And for a moment I thought he might step back, might let me go the way I had always expected him to. But instead he moved slightly, not closer, not imposing, just enough to make it clear he was not leaving. And that alone was enough to unsettle me more than anything else, because it meant he was willing to stay in a space where he did not have control. And that was not something I had ever seen him do before. You do not have to let me in, he continued, his voice steady, measured, but I am not walking away from my child. And there it was, the line that changed everything, the one thing I could not ignore, the one thing that made this no longer just about the past, because this was not just his regret, not just his realization, this was responsibility, and hearing him say it out loud made something inside me shift in a way I was not prepared for. My hand moved instinctively to my stomach, a protective gesture I had grown used to, and for the first time since he arrived, I did not immediately know what to say, because this was the part one had never planned for, the part where he did not deny it, did not walk away, did not choose power over everything else, and the uncertainty of that was more unsettling than the certainty I had lived with for years. I looked at him then, really looked, searching for something familiar to anchor myself to, but what I found instead was something new, something unresolved, something that did not fit into the version of him I had held on to all this time. And that made everything more complicated, because if he had not changed, this would be easy, I could walk away, without looking back. But if he had, even a little, then nothing about this was going to be simple anymore. And as I stood there in the doorway, caught between leaving and staying, between the life I had built and the past that refused to stay buried, I realized that for the first time, I was not just trying to protect myself from him. I was trying to understand whether the man standing in front of me was someone I could trust not to break everything all over again. I should have answered him right away, should have said something firm and final to close this conversation before it could go any further, but the words did not come as easily as they had before, because what he said lingered, heavier than anything else, not walking away from his child, and that changed the shape of everything. Because this was no longer just about us, not just about what he had done or what I had survived. It was about something that existed beyond both of us, something that would not disappear no matter how far I tried to go. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to think past the noise in my head, past the instinct to run, because running had always been the answer before, but now it felt incomplete, like it would not solve what this had become, and that realization unsettled me more than anything he had said. You do not get to rewrite what happened, I said finally, my voice quieter now, not because I was unsure, But because this was no longer about pushing him away with sharp edges, it was about holding ground in a situation that had already shifted beyond simple choices. You cannot show up now and expect everything to change just because you say it matters. And I watched him carefully, waiting for the reaction, for the resistance I had come to expect, but it did not come the way I thought it would. Instead, he nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he was acknowledging something he had already accepted, something he was not going to argue against. "I am not asking for that," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften it or make it easier, just a clear line that felt unexpectedly steady. "I am not asking you to forget or pretend none of it happened." And that made me pause, because it was not what I expected, not the argument, not the defense, just a statement that left no room for misunderstanding. "Then what are you asking for?" I asked, and for the first time since this started, it felt like a real question, not a challenge, not a defense, just something I needed to understand, because if this was going to continue, I needed to know where it was going. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and when he answered, there was something in his voice that felt different from before, less controlled, less calculated, like he was choosing his words instead of using them as tools. "A chance to do this right," he said, and something in my chest tightened at that, because it sounded simple, but it was not. It carried weight, responsibility, something real, and I did not know what to do with it. I looked away for a moment, trying to steady myself, because this was not part of the plan, none of this was, and every instinct I had built over the years was telling me to walk away, to keep things the way they were, safe, predictable, controlled. But another part of me, quieter but persistent, was asking a different question, one I had not allowed myself to consider until now. What if he meant it? I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, grounding myself before looking back at him, because I could not make this decision lightly, not when it affected more than just me, not when there was a future at stake that I had spent years protecting. "You do not get unlimited chances," I said finally, my voice steady again, but softer than before, because this was not rejection, not entirely, but it was not acceptance either. It was something in between, something cautious, something that felt like the beginning of a line I was not sure I wanted to cross. His expression did not shift into relief or victory, and that alone told me more than anything else, because it meant he understood. It meant he was not expecting this to be easy, and that made it feel more real than anything else he had said. "I know," he replied, just as quietly, and for a moment the space between us felt different again, not resolved, not settled, but changed, like something had moved from conflict into something more uncertain, more fragile. I glanced at the bag by the door, at the plan I had made, the life I had built waiting for me to return, and for the first time since I arrived, I hesitated, not because I did not know what to do, but because I realized that whatever I chose next, it was going to shape everything that came after. And as I looked back at him, standing there with a certainty that was no longer about power but something else entirely, I understood that this was no longer just about leaving or staying. It was about whether I was willing to risk everything I had built on the possibility that this time, he might actually choose differently. I did not move right away, even though everything in me was telling me to make a decision, to pick a direction and follow it before doubt had the chance to settle in. But doubt was already there, quiet and persistent, because this was no longer just about protecting myself from him. It was about deciding whether I was willing to let him be part of something I had carried alone for so long. I looked at the bag by the door again, the life waiting for me on the other side of a train ride, predictable, controlled, safe. And then I looked back at him, at the man who had once chosen everything else over me, standing here now with a different kind of certainty, one that did not come from power or expectation, but from something that felt more grounded, more real, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. "If I stay," I said slowly, the words careful, deliberate, because I needed them to be clear, because I could not afford to be misunderstood. "It is not because I trust you," and I held his gaze as I said it, making sure he understood the weight of that truth, because trust was not something that could be rebuilt with words, not after everything, not without time, and even then, it was not guaranteed. He did not interrupt, did not argue, just listened in that same steady way that felt unfamiliar but consistent with everything else that had changed, and that made it easier to continue. It is because this is not just about us anymore. I added, my hand resting lightly against my stomach, grounding myself in the one thing that had always been certain, the one thing that had given me the strength to walk away in the first place. His eyes followed the movement, softer now, not with pity, not with ownership, but with something closer to understanding, and when he nodded, it was slow, measured, like he was accepting terms he had not expected but was willing to honor. "That is enough," he said, and the simplicity of that response caught me off guard, because there was no negotiation in it, no attempt to push further, just acceptance, and that made something inside me ease, just slightly, just enough to let me breathe. I let out a quiet breath I had not realized I was holding, the tension in my shoulders loosening just a fraction, because this was not resolution, not even close, but it was something, a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but real. I walked back into the room then, moving past him without hesitation this time, setting my bag down by the bed instead of picking it up, and that small action felt heavier than anything else, because it meant I was choosing to stay, at least for now, choosing to face what this had become instead of running from it. He did not follow immediately, giving me space in a way I did not expect, and that mattered more than anything else, because it meant he understood that this could not be rushed, that whatever this was, it would have to be built slowly, carefully, if it was going to hold. I turned back after a moment, meeting his gaze again, and for the first time since he appeared, the space between us did not feel like something I needed to escape. It felt like something that could be navigated, something that might, eventually, become something steady. "One step at a time," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway, and when he nodded again, there was no urgency in it, no pressure, just agreement, and that made it easier to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The future was still uncertain, still complicated in ways I could not fully see yet. But as I stood there, no longer on the edge of leaving, no longer holding on to the past as tightly as before, I realized that this was not about forgetting what had happened or pretending it did not matter. It was about choosing what came next despite it. And for the first time in a long time, that choice did not feel like something I had to face alone.